Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. Welcome to the Library of Virginia. I am very pleased to welcome historian and author Marc Leepson, also a former Library of Virginia Foundation board member. Glad that he's here today. He will be discussing The Unlikely War Hero, a Vietnam War POW story of courage and resilience in the Hanoi Hilton. In this new book, Leepson explores the extraordinary story of Doug Hegdahl. I should have asked him how to say the last name before I started. The youngest and lowest ranking American to be captured in North Vietnam and held prisoner in the notorious Hỏa Lò Prison in Hanoi. The book is available for purchase in the Virginia shop, and there will be a signing immediately after this. So I encourage you to go back out to the lobby after today's talk and visit with Marc, and also be able to have signed copies of his book. Marc Leepson is the author of 11 books, including Saving Monticello, Lafayette, Idealist General, Flag, an American Biography, What So Proudly We Hailed, Francis Scott Key, A Life, The Ballad of the Green Beret, and the Webster's New World Dictionary of the Vietnam War. The former staff writer in Congressional Quarterly in Washington, D.C., he has written for many publications, including the Washington Post, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and for the Encyclopedia Britannica and the Dictionary of Virginia Biography. He is senior writer, arts editor, and columnist for the VVA Veteran, the magazine published by Vietnam Veterans of America. From 2008 to 2015, he taught U.S. history at Laurel Ridge Community College in Warrenton, Virginia. He graduated from George Washington University. I won't give you the year as a favor, even though it's written in my remarks. After serving in the U.S. Army from 1967 to 69, including a year in the Vietnam War, he received his honorable discharge and earned a master's degree in history from George Washington in 1971. A longtime library advocate and friend, as we stated earlier, he has served on the Loudoun County Library Board of Trustees, the Library of Virginia Foundation Board, and the Virginia Library Board as well. He and his wife, Jana, live in Middleburg, Virginia. And with that, I will hand it over to Marc Leepson, so welcome.
Okay, thanks, Scott. That was Scott Dotson. He didn't introduce himself, who's executive director of the foundation. Thank you all for coming. And I wanted to thank you, Scott, for that excellent introduction and for reading it the way that I wrote it. So it always works out best that way. So thank you very much for coming. It's my pleasure to do a talk today about this book that I wrote that came out in December about the unlikely war hero, Doug Hegdahl. And I'm going to tell you, in the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to give you the highlights of the book. I could go on for hours about it, but it's all in here. And of course, I'm going to have to skip over stuff. But I think you'll get a good idea of what this book is about. And this is a unique Vietnam War story. It's a unique prisoner of war story. And I think you'll know why. So what I'm going to do is give you a short history of Doug's life, and you'll see why we call him the unlikely war hero by his growing up and his very, very brief Navy career. So let's just jump right into it. So he was born in eastern South Dakota in a small town called Clark. And it was a small town. I think its population peaked around the 1890s, about 1,500, and it was about 1,300 when he grew up there. You can see it's about a 4-mile drive west of Minneapolis and about 3 miles south of Fargo. And like many places in eastern South Dakota, it was populated. It was Sioux territory, it was Native American territory, and then people from mostly Norway, Norwegians came, mostly farmers. We're talking about the 1870s, 1880s. There was very rich, 1880s, 1890s, very rich farmland there. And you can see, this is a picture of around Clark. About that time, they lived in sod houses. The entire family worked the farm, and all four of Doug's grandparents came over during that time period, even before South Dakota became a state. South Dakota, Clark actually literally got on the map in the late 1880s when what happened, as what usually happens in that time period, a railroad came through. So the railroad came through right this Clark Crossroads, and that's how Clark came to be. And so, to me, it took some rugged people to move to this kind of place. And this is a photo from around, like, population 1,200, about 1920. And, I'm a historian, and I love old photos. And I don't know why this one is blank, but I think I had another. Anyway, so let's talk about the Hegdahl. So Abe and Edith Hegdahl, they were first-generation Americans. All four of their parents, his parents and her parents came here from Norway. And they had 3 boys. They were born in Watertown, South Dakota, nearby. And then in the mid-50s, they moved to Clark, where Abe and Edith went into the hospitality business, and they bought this hotel. Isn't it beautiful? The family lived there, too, so all 3 boys grew up in. The official name was the Clark Hotel. People called it the Hegdahl Hotel because the family lived there. The boys would bring their friends by to play. And you know what? When I was doing the research for the book, and I talked to several people that Doug grew up with, right in the middle of one of the conversations, one of the guys said, "Oh," I said, "Well, did you call it the Hegdahl Hotel?" He said, "Yeah, we also called it the Hegdahl Hilton." And about which time I almost fell off my chair. The irony of Doug growing up in the Hegdahl Hilton and then, going to the also sarcastically named Hanoi Hilton. So the boys grew up there. This was baby boom years, the 50s and the early 60s, mid 60s. And after Doug went into the Navy, Abe and Edith opened up a much nicer place on the outside of town called the A&E Motel after Abe and Edith. So so Doug was a big kid. He was 6'2", something like that, 220 pounds. This is a picture from his sophomore yearbook with him on the left without his glasses. We're going to see him in glasses practically the rest of the time. So he was athletic. He was on the wrestling team. He wrestled heavyweight. That's a picture of him on the wrestling team. I think, can you see that I have him circled there? I talked to the librarian there, and she kindly sent me this. This was his, for all of us in my age bracket, didn't that look like every kid you went to high school with in the 60s, his high school yearbook photo? Now, Doug was a smart guy, but he wasn't motivated. So it did take him 5 years to get through high school. So he was a year older than most. He graduated in '66. And everybody here who grew up during that time knows what was going on then. The Vietnam War was about to reach its height. Draft levels were hugely high. He knew that after he graduated from high school, he was going to get drafted into the Army. So he did what a lot of people did to avoid that. He joined the Navy. And he grew up in a landlocked state. He'd never even seen the ocean. He went to a Navy recruiter, and the recruiter said, where would you like to go, Doug? Sail the 7 seas. He said, Australia would be great. The recruiter said, that'd be great, just sign right here. So 4 years he signed for. Australia didn't happen, of course. He signed up to be a postal clerk, by the way. And that never happened, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But he did go to the big training base down there in San Diego. It was a rough time through boot camp. He got recycled. Those of you in the military know what that means, right? You can't flunk out of boot camp, right? If you mess up, you start all over again. So Doug recycled. He got through. Something happened with paperwork. They had him hang around there it's unclear what happened. Postal school never happened. They sent him home to Clark for Christmas, and then in February he came back to San Diego, and he got orders to go to Subic Bay in the Philippines, where this ship, the USS Canberra, by the way, serving on the USS Canberra was the closest Doug got to Australia in his brief naval career. The Canberra is an interesting ship, and it was in Subic Bay for rearming. It was a guided missile cruiser. It was the second guided missile ship the Navy had. It was a vintage World War II, took part fighting in the Pacific. This was before missiles. And then in the mid-50s, when Terrier missiles were first developed, the Canberra and one other ship were the first Navy ships to carry missiles. Now, Canberra had 5 Vietnam War cruises. Not a missile was fired in anger. They only did some for testing. However, they had these huge guns, 5-inch and 8-inch guns, that pounded the coast. They went up and down the coast from the bottom of South Vietnam over the line into North Vietnam. And this is in January '67, just before Doug got on board. Navy, these are all great Navy pictures. I love them. You really get an idea for what they're like. Those shells could go for miles. And the captain at the time was Ed Rosenberg. Now, I talked to 22 sailors who were on one of those 5 cruises, including, I think, 8 or 9 who were on Doug's cruise. And 3 of his officers who were on Doug's cruise, they all called him trigger happy. Ed Rosenberg loved to fire the gun. In fact, that's why they were in the Philippines back in February, because they had fired so many, we're talking about tens of thousands of shells from those 8-inch guns, that they all had to be rebored, which you can imagine was a big process. So that's about all I want to tell you about Ed Rosenberg. So here's the deal. Doug was a postal clerk? No. He was assigned to the deck crew. Do we have any Navy people out here? You all know what the deck crew is? Right. So those were the people that sometimes called deck apes, who lived underneath most of the time. The Canberra had about 1,100, crew of about 1,100, including 100 Marines. But the deck crew did the swabby work. You know, they painted everything that didn't move and did that. And Doug's job was ammunition handler. Not exactly a great job. And they did 12 hours on, 12 hours off. He lived underneath in just, these triple bunks where he was so big, he was like, inches. His head was inches, below the top bunk. Anyway, it wasn't a lot of fun. And it wasn't anything like Doug thought it would be. So on early morning hours of April 6, 1967, someone had told him it was really cool to watch those big guns firing at night. And it is. I mean, there's a picture of it. So Doug, we don't know exactly what time, but we're thinking probably around 4 a.m. He got up, didn't even put on his glasses, walked out to get some air and to see the big guns firing. And the next thing that happened, he says he knew when he got on the deck, which was not very wide there, he was in the South China Sea. No one saw it. He says he does not remember. He testified before Congress. He testified for his official debriefers. That's what he said the whole time. He doesn't know, but there he was in the water. And trying to put together exactly what happened, luckily for me and other historians, the Navy's deck logs are all declassified in the National Archives and digitized. So I was able to look at the deck logs. In other words, this is the guy on the deck who writes by hand every minute of what's happening. The Navy really is great about keeping track of everything that happens on board. So I was able to, and that's my chicken scratches on the side, but I was able to determine when the firing started that morning and when it didn't, and it was like approximately 25 or 30 minutes from 4 to 4:30, something like that. So that's when we know that Doug went overboard. And so there's the muster for the next morning. Well, you can see where I wrote commence firing and so on. Well, they had 2 musters that morning. And the first muster, a muster is when they do a roll call, who's here. Everybody was supposedly present and accounted for, but we're 99% certain Doug was in the drink at that point. They did a second muster, and that's when Seaman Hegdahl was reported missing. And they did a search of the ship, and they never found him. And you know what the Captain Ed Rosenberg did? He just took off. And I talked to those 3 officers. None of them remembers any kind of search and rescue mission. They don't think there were any planes that came to look. You can read the logs from the following hours. They refueled, they got water, they did this and they did that. So that's that. The account of Doug, of what happened after Doug fell overboard, is what came from him. And he has told many times and to different people. And he says that he was in, and so he doesn't know exactly how long he was in the water. I think it was at least 3 hours. And don't forget, he was a big, strong kid, but even big, strong kids can't last that long in the water. So he says that he actually started sinking one time. He woke up and he managed to get himself resurface. And then as he was losing steam, he looked up and he said it looked to him like a Viking ship, but it was a rudimentary Vietnamese fishing boat. And they fished him out of the water. And Doug says that he was the only POW in the Hanoi Hilton who was not captured. He was rescued. So they actually treated him well. They gave him dry clothes. They gave him a little bit of food. But then they took him to land, turned him over to the authorities, and they didn't treat him very well. They roughed him up a little bit. They kind of beat him up a little bit. And then they took off his shoes, and they marched him to a truck, and then the truck went to the Hanoi Hilton. So you've all heard of the Hanoi Hilton. Hỏa Lò is the Vietnamese name for it. It's an old French, and okay, so there is not one Hanoi Hilton. It's a series of POW camps centered on Maison Centrale, which was the old French colonial prison, which was like hell on earth for anybody who was Vietnamese, who they even thought of was, had an idea in their head that they wanted to take part in the revolution against the French colonial masters. There's instruments of torture and other things in there. So, and here's a picture of Hỏa Lò, Maison Centrale today. It's a tourist attraction. You can go in there, many people have. And so, like I said, let me go back. Another blank. Okay, I said that the Hanoi Hilton was there, so there were a series of POW camps centered in Hanoi, and that's just some of them. And we have them with the nicknames that the guys gave to them: Camp Hope, Camp Fail. The two of the biggest ones were called the Zoo and the Plantation, and that's where Doug spent most of his time when he was in Hanoi. And here's a few more pictures. Yeah, they had a guillotine in there. The French, the Vietnamese did not use it, but believe me, that we don't know how many, but there were about 561 or something like that came home, in 1973, and more than 600 were taken. But guys died in there. Guys died who were from disease, from being tortured. And this is a picture, probably a staged picture that the Vietnamese let out, and so is this one. So Doug, they had a system for when they brought in Americans. They were interrogated, and the Vietnamese asked this guy, what happened? How did you get here? And he said he fell off a ship, and they said, yeah, right. And they thought he was a spy. So there are people today who believe Doug was a spy. Like the CIA trained him to fall. No. So anyway, he convinced them that he wasn't a spy, and that moreover, he was a 20-year-old E2, seaman apprentice, second lowest rank in the Navy. And they realized they didn't have any propaganda value to get from Doug. They asked him about his ship, and he told them, but on his own, he figured out something that really saved him from torture and led to his release, bringing home all these names. We'll get to the names in a minute. He played dumb. He wasn't dumb. He was smart. But he acted like he didn't understand what they were saying. What's your name, Doug? Could you write? I don't know. Do you know how to spell Doug? Stuff like that. They would give him a pen to write something. He'd put it in his mouth and have the ink drip down his... And all kinds of other things like that, to the point where one of the interrogators called him the incredibly stupid one. Okay, he was not stupid. He was playing the Vietnamese. And you know what? They finally believed his story, which was true. They realized they couldn't get anything. He didn't have any propaganda value to them. He never was tortured. He was roughed up a couple of times, but nothing like what the horrors that a lot of those guys had to go through. And he was a unique individual. Everybody, Look, these prisoners at this point were not allowed to communicate if they did, they'd get tortured. Of course, they developed a way to communicate. You all know this, right? The tap code, where they figured out this Morse code kind of thing, and the walls of the cells that adjoined, everybody would tap who they were. They'd try to keep tabs of who was there, what happened to them, and so on. They also passed notes, because they were allowed 3 cigarettes a day for some reason. And they would write little notes on cigarette papers, and they weren't allowed to talk to us. But when they were on the way to the latrines or whatever, they would hide them for people to talk. So the prisoners did have a kind of good communication going, but they weren't allowed to talk to each other, and they moved guys around a lot. So Doug was in a unique position, and part of the uniqueness was who he was and how young he was. He was 20 years old. He was by far the youngest guy there. So let's just talk about more or less who he was in there with. Virtually everyone he was in there for the next 19 months were either pilots or backseaters who were either shot down or crashed over North Vietnam. Several, like maybe in Laos, and they were shipped up into Hanoi. I think you may know the name Everett Alvarez. He was the first POW who was shot down. You can see the dates. And he was in there I got to talk to Commander Alvarez. He's still with us. He lives up in Northern Virginia. He was in the same prison with Doug that whole time. He never saw him, but he heard about him. Everybody knew the story of Doug, and he was able to tell me a couple of good things about him. I don't know if you know the name Bob Schumacher. He was the second pilot shot down, another typical guy. He was held till 73. Supposedly, Bob thought up the name Hanoi Hilton. And you may know Jeremiah Denton. He was the class of 47 at the Naval Academy. So he was like 20 years older than, a lot of these guys were 5, 10, 15, 20 years older than the kid. And he was a known resistor, got tortured an awful lot of times. There was one of the prisons that were set aside for the resistors, and Denton was in there most of the time. You may remember that he gave an interview on Japanese TV where he blinked out the word torture with his eyes. That was picked up. The Vietnamese didn't know it at the time. A really gutsy thing to do. He wasn't released till 73. You may remember Jim Stockdale, Admiral James Stockdale. He was, what was he? Naval Academy, class of 46. He was a year older than Denton. He was the highest ranking POW most of the time. They evolved an unofficial chain of command behind bars, the POWs. So Commander, he later became an admiral, Jim Stockdale, and they knew it. The Vietnamese knew who was in charge. He was tortured mercilessly. You could see him in that middle picture when he was coming home, what he looked like. But, he did a recovery, went on to get a PhD. He's really amazing. I got to meet Admiral Stockdale one time at a veterans convention. I was just a man that I admire very much. He received the Medal of Honor for what he did as the leader of the POWs in the camp. And then, John McCain, probably the most famous. And, a lot of these guys like McCain were Naval Academy graduates, not Clark High School graduates who took 5 years to get through high school. You know the story about McCain. His father was Admiral McCain, who was a chief of the naval operations in the Pacific. North Vietnamese knew that, and he broke his back, or he was severely injured. He was saved by Vietnamese doctors, but when they got him in the prison camp, he was just in really terrible condition. 2 POWs basically took care of him for, over a year, when he wouldn't have survived if they hadn't done everything for him. Here's a picture of him when he was being tended to right after he was shot down. That's him coming home. And then I want to talk about Dick Stratton, another. He went to Georgetown, class of 55. He was a high-flying Navy aviator. He got shot down a little bit before Doug got there. So they were always moving the prisoners in and out of cells for reasons nobody could quite figure out. Doug was in with one guy, and then after a couple months, they threw him in with Stratton. And they immediately, they were suspicious of each other. Doug said, "Who is this high school? What the hell? What the heck is he doing here?" And but they warmed up to each other. They became very good friends the whole time that Doug was there, and the whole time, especially when he was in with Stratton, and afterward too. And this is a picture from a German propaganda film. That's Doug and Stratton. This is actually before they met each other, before they were in together. They managed to exchange a few words while they were taking a shower together. And this is Joe Kreck. I'm going to get back to Stratton in a minute because he has a big part in this story. So he went after Stratton. He went with Joe Kreck, who was a little bit younger, but he is also important in the story, and I'll tell you why. So, the names. So, when Doug was in with Stratton, aside from, being tortured and being treated, horribly, the biggest problem for the prisoners was boredom, right? The hours and hours and hours every day, nothing. They weren't allowed to read, listen, nothing. So a lot of them, one of the things that they did besides, try to remember every sporting event they ever went to or whatever, was memorize names, right? And remember, they did communicate through the tap code. So a fair number of, and why did they do that? Well, the North Vietnamese were not exactly forthcoming about who they were holding. They did trumpet the fact that they had John McCain. There was pictures in the paper and several others. And we did have intel. We did have intel from spy planes, from coded letters that guys wrote home, that we had an idea. But we didn't really. So, and also because of what happened during the Korean War, when the North Koreans did not return prisoners or just people disappeared off the face of the earth after they were taken prisoners. So they wanted to keep an accounting. So one day, Dick and Doug were in the cell, and I don't know how it came up. I think Doug said he knew the names and birthplaces of all the presidents. Oh yeah, tell me. Boom, he rattled them off. He said, yeah, I can also recite the Declaration of Independence. I'm getting all this from Stratton. I interviewed Stratton probably 20 times. He was great. I'm sorry to say that he died in January. He was 92, but he's a great guy. He really couldn't have written this book without him. So Stratton one day Doug said, I can recite the Declaration of Independence. I can recite Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And Dick said, yeah, come on, who can't do that? He said, I can do it backwards. He said, what? Are you kidding me? So he said, I'll tell you what. Doug said, Dick, why don't you write the words down on the floor of the cell so you can see that I do it right. And the cells, some of them had just sand, and he got a rock, and he started writing that, and he wrote it all out. And Doug stood behind him, and he recited it backwards. And Stratton thought, man, we got to get this guy in the naming program. Okay, so he started, they shared information, and for the next couple of months, Doug had about 150 names. Approximately 150 names, services and ranks, and any other information he had. They could get about him. Now, when I talked to Stratton, he said, I have to tell you something about the Gettysburg Address story. One day, my wife and I and Doug were driving somewhere, and Alice, his wife, brought up the Gettysburg Address story, and Doug started laughing. She said, what are you laughing about, Doug? He said, well, you know what, Dick, while he was writing it on the ground, I was reading it over his shoulder. So I'm sorry, but, I never did that. It was a stunt. After he finished writing it, Doug read it over his shoulder. So anyway, it's a great story, and, I'm sorry I'm ruining it for everybody, but people keep telling it, but Doug did not know that keep wanting to say Declaration of Independence because I'm in Virginia, and Thomas Jefferson wrote it. So anyway, okay, so when they didn't know he was memorizing names, or anybody. By the way, other prisoners memorized names. McCain had 350. And this was in the event, that anybody would come home early. So we'll get to the coming home early in a minute. So Doug, when they realized they had no use for him, they gave him quote-unquote privileges, one of which he was let out of his cell more often than others. Here's a picture of him. It's a propaganda picture. I think it's colorized, of him sweeping, Well, guess what? Doug had learned the tap code, and he also learned the sweeping code. So when he was out there sweeping, what he was doing with the broom was giving it, and guys could peer through little slits on top of their doors. So he was giving information to other prisoners while he was doing that. This is a couple of pictures that they released of him early in his prison, or early during his capture. And then, so this was, Doug went on a hunger strike. He acted out of character. Remember, all the time he was playing the village idiot. But one time, a guy next to his cell was caught communicating. and they tortured him. And Doug complained and said, you can't, okay, yeah, boom. They put him in solitary for 9 months. And after a few months, he went on a hunger strike, and this is a picture afterward, and they only let him out after he agreed to eat because it was an embarrassment to them. And there's a couple of pictures of him afterward, propaganda pictures. Oh, he also asked for glasses. That was his one demand, and they did. So let's talk about early releases. So little known fact, 12 POWs from the Hanoi Hilton complex were released early. 11 of them had to sign papers admitting that they were war criminals and that the American war was horrible. Doug never had to do it. They wanted to get rid of him. They offered to get rid of him early I guess it was in 68. And, the other prisoners did not look favorably upon the prisoners who took the early releases because of that. So Doug knew that, and he refused Stratton's direct. Stratton said, we should send this kid home. He's got 250 names by now. Went through the chain of command, secret chain of command, and they said, okay, order him home. He ordered him home. Doug disobeyed. But they gave him, the Americans gave him the slack because of his reason. He didn't want to. Anyway, after the 9 months of torture, of solitary, the Vietnamese singled him out again and said, you can go home. We want to get rid of you, basically. Stratton said go. Doug said he would go. So I'm skipping a lot here, but let's get up to the release. And that happened in August of 1969. So that was, a year and 4 or 5 months after he was captured. He went home with 2 flyers who were shot down, had only been there a few months, 4, 5, 6, 7 months each. Bob Frischman in the middle, who was severely wounded. He's actually lost an elbow that had to be replaced. And Wes Rumble, who was an Air Force pilot, who was really hurt when he was too. So we had some, the way the North Vietnamese arranged these, they released them in 3. So 4 times there were 12 early releasees. They released them to American anti-war people who came over. One of them, in this case, was Rennie Davis. You may have heard of him. He was active in the NRA. He was one of the Chicago 8. So they had a little propaganda ceremony at the Hanoi Hilton. They went to the airport in Hanoi. They got on a private plane, and they flew to Vientiane, Laos. And this is them, the 3 guys and Davis on the right, after they disembarked on the tarmac. What you can't see is facing them was about 50 reporters, because this was big news, the POWs released. Doug didn't do much talking, although you see him here. Frischman did most of the talking. They got a little debriefing in the ambassador's residence. They put him on another plane, gave him clean clothes, and they flew to Bangkok, Thailand, again, where they got some good old American food. They got to call home, and then they took a commercial flight that stopped like 4 or 5 times, including Frankfurt, where they got clean new uniforms. They all got promotions, retroactive. And this is them arriving at Kennedy Airport, New York City, on August 7th. This was on the tarmac. That's Edith and Abe, Doug's parents, next to him, and that's Frischman's wife on the side. Again, Frischman kind of hogged the microphone. Doug didn't say very much. I mean, they were all smiles, but it wasn't all smiles, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So Rumble was sick. So he went to an Air Force hospital, and then they took him to another one in California, and he was out of the picture for the rest of the time. He did not want to deal with the POW issue. Doug and Frischman spent a month in Bethesda Naval Hospital in a special ward up on the, whatever it is, 15th floor, where they were debriefed. Doug was debriefed 11 times. I got to read 2 of the debriefs that had been declassified. And of course, their medical and psychological needs taken care of. At the end, okay, so let's just back up a minute. So they were there from, when they got back August 7th to September 3rd. I think you know that Lyndon Johnson did not want to deal with the POW issue. There were peace talks going on starting in '68. He thought it would be a disruption. I think you probably know that the wives of some of the POWs got together and formed a group to try to lobby the federal government to do more, to at least provide visits, humanitarian aid. They didn't know about torture, but they strongly suspected it. And Johnson said, no, you be quiet. No, we're not going to deal. Well, when Nixon came in, he won the 1968 election, became president in January 1969. The administration decided that they would amp up the POW issue. They welcomed the wives, and they had a press. So by the spring of 1969, the POW issue was the #1 issue of the Vietnam War. The Nixon campaign started what they called the Go Public campaign. That's Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird announcing it officially in May. And the Go Public was the opposite of what Johnson was doing. They were going to try to put pressure on the North Vietnamese by publicizing the plight of the POWs. And guess where they got a lot of their information from? Frischman and Doug Hegdahl, who described conditions. And that Doug, of course, brought back names with him. They didn't talk about the names right away in public because they were still trying to figure out, they were trying to match. So Doug gave 254 names. Like I said, we had intel on a lot. But with the names that Doug brought back, we were able to reclassify from missing in action to prisoner in war of 64 men. 64 families learned, and the Pentagon let them know right away, that their fathers, brothers, uncles, sons were alive. They were in prison, but they knew they were alive, because you probably know that MIA usually means that you didn't make it, especially after months and months have gone by. So there was just getting ahead of myself a little bit. So with the Nixon administration putting the pressure on, with Doug, and to a lesser extent, Frischman, telling for the first time to the American public first-hand accounts of the non-humanitarian treatment, these, the horrible food they were given, moldy bread and with boll weevils in it, and sweet potato soup twice a day, and, not being able to talk to each other, and, no visits from the Red Cross, those unhumanitarian conditions. With that, and with the Nixon administration's putting the pressure on, and then this happened that same day. Ho Chi Minh died on September 3rd. September 2nd, but, word didn't get here because of the Dateline, international Dateline thing. There was a change in the leadership of the Vietnamese Politburo. It was evolving at the time. Ho was losing, you know who Ho Chi Minh was. He was the Revolutionary War leader since the end of World War I, had been fighting for Vietnamese freedom, revolution against the French. Yes, he was a communist. He was also a nationalist. The Americans supported him during World War II, fighting the Japanese who occupied Vietnam. But after the French recolonization, the war continued, and then we took over the war, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, Ho Chi Minh died. There was a change at the Politburo, and there's a resolution that was passed later on in the fall, which, and it's been declassified. You can read it online. I read it. It starts out with the propaganda. Oh, we've always treated them humanely, but we're going to, give them more humane. I don't know. I'm paraphrasing, but when you read the POW memoirs, they all talk about the torture did not stop, but it eased considerably. They were allowed to communicate. They were allowed to have more than two guys in a room. They got 5 cigarettes a day instead of 3. But it was a big thing. It was caused by 3 things: the change in the Politburo, the Nixon administration pressure, and by what Frischman and primarily Hegdahl told the American public about what was happening. So Doug goes home. They gave him a big, big, I don't know there's that many people there, but it was Clark. So the whole town showed up, got a ride in a Cadillac car down Main Street. There's Abe and Edith with Doug with a big smile on his face. But, I talked to his friends who hung out with him when he was there. He was not a happy camper. He didn't like the attention. He never did. He wanted to get away from it. He had a handler with him, and he escaped him one day, and one of the guys told me, and they went to have a couple of beers. They said it was the highlight of his trip home. And here's more about how Nixon embraced the POW wives. There's a great book about that called League of Wives by Heath Lee, who's from Richmond. He helped me a lot with this book, and I did a little bit of help for her with the League of Wives book, too. You know who else got involved in it? Ross Perot. Does that name ring a bell? He started an organization on his own called United We Stand, which he redid when he ran for president in '92. He took, he thought he could get the Vietnamese to give more humanitarian, make it more humanitarian for the prisoners by publicizing it. So he had wives, he put ads in newspapers. He chartered a plane on his own and filled it with how many thousands of, supplies for the POWs, flew it to Laos, and the North Vietnamese wouldn't let him into Vietnam. This was in December of '70. And then he put something like, 58 American women and 94 of their children, POW wives, on a plane to Paris at Christmas time. He thought they would influence the North Vietnamese during the Paris peace talks. They landed at Christmas. They wouldn't talk to him. They went to Notre Dame Cathedral for Christmas ceremonies. Then they sent word, 3 women went to talk to him. They just gave him the propaganda and they went home the next day. There was a huge POW event at Constitution Hall in 1970 that Doug spoke at. I'm just going to have to go over these because we're running out of time, but I talk a lot about him. And the POW issue was the #1 issue in the Vietnam War, 1969-70. There's a rally that Doug appeared at what was that, May of '70. Perot thought it would be a great pressure for the Vietnamese to make up mock cells, including tiger cages. One was displayed in the Capitol in the basement. He wanted them all over the country. And then, and Doug had gotten out of the Navy in September of '70, but in December he got a call from Perot, who said, "You want to go to Paris?" And Doug said, "Okay." So he sent him to Paris on a plane with 2 of his guides. And one of his buddies told me, by the way, Doug did not talk to me. When I say who told me what and this and that, Doug did not talk to me. He's not spoken in public for 25 years. He just says he's a private person. But one of his buddies told me, Doug told him that Perot had his men up in first, but Doug flew over in coach, which he never understood. But they did stay at a nice hotel. He got to see the Vietnamese. They let him into, and he started saying, well, here's what we want. We want the Red Cross to come. We want more letters. We want more openness. They said, thank you, goodbye. So it made headlines in some of the papers. Hegdahl returns from Harris, all 5 requests from crews. Remember POW issue? Remember the POW bracelets? The POW MIA flag? I think that was '71. And they're still out in front of every public building, American, right now. Like I said, Doug got an early out, got out of the Navy just before his term of enlistment. He went to San Diego. He stayed for a while with the Stockdales. This is a picture of the Strattons. I'm ahead of myself a little bit. He stayed for a while with the Stockdales. Admiral Stockdale was still in prison, but his wife, Sybil Stockdale, who was one of the leaders of the National Wives of Prisoners in Missing Action, took him in, found him a house, and she got him a job at the Navy SEER School, the survival school at Coronado. And Doug worked as a civilian there for 30 years, teaching. And I interviewed a couple people and read of a couple people who took survival training from Doug that said it was very, very useful. He was a great instructor. He was friends with, when Dick got back, he was friends with Dick Stratton. That's a picture of him when he came home. He had 3 sons, that's his wife. And these are pictures that Dick sent me of him and Alice, his wife. That was right after Dick came back. And this was 1978. This was 1988. Oh, here's the SEER school I mentioned. I should have put that in there. And there's Jim Stockdale after he came home. They're both gone now. And there's a picture of Doug the day of his retirement from the SEER school, and that's Jim Stockdale there. He got a plaque, and the school has since been renamed in Jim Stockdale's honor. So Doug has, like I said, I had the idea to write this book 25 years ago. After the Monticello book came out, I wrote this book called Saving Monticello. I was looking for another book, and I had known about the story. I write an awful lot about the Vietnam War and Vietnam War veterans, and the story's been out there. So I managed to get a hold of Doug in San Diego. He still lives there. He lived there then, he still does now. And I talked to him. He answered some of my questions. The next time I called, he said, I'm a private person. I've done, he did talk a lot when he came home. He went around visiting, I didn't say this, he went around visiting POW families after Bethesda. He went all over the country. The Navy sent him there, and Frischman. And, a couple of times he ran into people. He said one time he met a young woman. She said, did you run into my father, Captain so-and-so? Yes, I did. I saw him, 6 months ago. He's alive and well. And that was the first that they heard. Several others, it was the first that they heard that their loved ones were alive from Doug. And he talked to two, and there are two books from the early 70s in which he's quoted extensively, which is where I got a lot of the information. But really, since 01, 02, 03, he appeared in a couple of documentaries, but just a couple of talking heads. That's one of the latest ones. So he is not talking, and this is from 04. He's retired, he lives in San Diego, he likes to ride his bike, So I think I'll end it there, except just to tell you that about the title of the book, The Unlikely War Hero. I don't use the word hero lightly. In fact, I don't like it when it's not used lightly. They call all 2.8 million of us who went to Vietnam heroes. I went, I'm no hero. I did my duty and I came home. Doug is a true hero of the Vietnam War, and there are lots of others. But I will tell you one thing, last thing I'll say, that uniquely Doug, is that I believe that Doug Hegdahl performed one of the most heroic acts, not in combat, during the Vietnam War. So I'll just leave you with that. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. And we do have time for questions. And if you do have a question, if you don't mind, there's a mic, because you're going to have a starring role on a C-SPAN documentary coming up. So feel free. Yeah, I did leave a lot out. So, and I tried to cram in as much as I could in this short amount of time, but it's it's really, the story, like I said earlier, I think the story's been out there, but you know what happens when the story's been out there and the original person is not talking. Things get to be, they're all secondhand at best, So a lot of stuff is not true. Sometimes you'll hear that he memorized 254 names by putting them to Mary Had a Little Lamb, right? And so, I asked Stratton about it. He said, what are you, crazy? No. I mean, he did do it in a sing-songy voice, and he may have used Mary Had a Little Lamb. But no, that's not true. But that one people love to retell. And in fact, in one of the documentaries, they ask him, well, 30 years later or whatever this is, can you recite the names? And he does. And it's like rapidly, Joe Jones, Major Jones, blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of sing-songy, but forget the Mary Had a little lammy thing. Yeah. And by the way, he did it so rapidly on his first debriefing that the debriefer asked him to stop and brought in a tape recorder and taped him and then slowly played it back so they would get the list of the names. Do you have a question?
Do you think there are any more, is Vietnam still holding some people?
Is Vietnam still holding prisoners? Man, it's been 50 years. I doubt it. And I've written about the Vietnam War for 40 years in journalism, and I've written about the POW and MIA issues. And they get conflated. It's called POW, MIA. They're two different things. We still have something like 1,500 Americans missing and unaccounted for in the war. And which sounds like a big number, but if you look back on World War II, for instance, at the end of that war, there were 78,000 Americans missing in territory that we had control of. And a year later, President Truman declared them all KIA. So in Vietnam, there were over 2,000 when it ended. The Vietnamese have been cooperating for about 15 years with us to try to account for as many MIAs as possible. As far as the POWs are concerned, there have always been rumors. And I've written about it a lot, and I've asked PO. One thing every time when that issue, and it hasn't been in the news for a long time because it was unlikely then. It's almost impossible now. I would always ask, did any guys who were alive that did not come home? They all told me no. So I think it's possible that some were left behind for snafus or whatever, but no. Yeah. Yes.
That was great talk. The term seaman apprentice implies to me that you're sort of still learning, and was it unusual for a seaman apprentice to be on board a ship, or shouldn't he be somewhere getting more training? Or
Yeah, now with the caveat that I was in the Army, and I don't know a lot. I did talk to Navy people. I talked to 2 former chief Navy historians. I talked to a buddy of mine who served on a ship in the Tonkin Gulf, so I got a little bit of it. But I can just tell you that a war was going on. They needed bodies, right? So I think in an ideal world, he wouldn't have been on that ship unless he had gotten an MOS, a military occupational specialty like postal clerk. But I can tell you, I'll just give you my experience. So I was drafted on July 11th, 1967, not that I don't remember that exact date. And I went to basic and advanced training, and I was in Vietnam on December 13th, 1967. I was also an E2. And what the Army did was they almost immediately promoted you to E3, private E3, because, well, back then it was called PFC, private first class. I think it still is E3, yeah. But anyway, they told us, this was the rumor. The rumor was that they didn't want to, if you got killed, they didn't want you to be a private. You know what I mean? They wanted you to be a PFC. So that's just from my experience, and it doesn't really answer your question. But I think it's because there was a war going on, and in an ideal world, he would have gone to postal school and got it posted as. But they tried to do that, but the needs of the Navy came first. That's my educated guess on that.
Hi, thanks. It was a great talk. Really appreciate it. Learned a lot. Can you tell me more about the codes that they used, especially with the broom?
The tap code?
Yeah, the broom.
It was a kind of Morse code where each letter had a tap. It wasn't each letter. They made a grid with all the letters except for K, I think, because C and K was, anyway. So if like 2 shorts and 1 long meant it was I'm going to get this wrong, but it was at a certain point on the board. So they knew you learned the board, and then they did it letter by letter. I don't know. How did it work with the? Well, it was short and long. 1 long, 2 shorts. Yeah. I know. They had a lot of time in their hands, remember? It was brilliant, though. It worked. Absolutely. Yeah. By the way, the other thing I wanted to say about me going over as an E2, back then you had no stripes if you were E1 or E2. So you looked like you were, and PFC was just 1 stripe, but at least you had that, so.
Thanks, it was a good talk. Have you been back to see the Hanoi Hilton as a tourist attraction?
I have not been back to Vietnam. Yeah, I'm so lucky. I didn't, I was drafted. I didn't have the choice of what job I was going to do. I thought for sure I was going to be in the jungle as a rifleman, and they'd sent me to clerk school, and I was a clerk, and I got even luckier when I went to Vietnam because I was assigned to a personnel company, and I was there during Tet 68. We got hit, but for me, the Vietnam War was, a lot of guard duty, a lot of paperwork. So I had no, I had the usual readjustment problems, but I had nothing calling me back, and I don't like flying over oceans either, so. I mean, that, you know, one thing you'll never forget is that flight, you know, when 250 strangers got on an airplane outside of Oakland Army Base, and we went up to Alaska and over to Japan and then to Vietnam, and we got out, and, you know, that flight might have done me. I mean, I've been to Europe a bunch of times, but in Hawaii a couple times, but oh, what was your question? No, I wouldn't mind. If I could teleport there, I'd love to see it.